Style. What is it and where does it come from? We're going to talk about that next on this episode of the Synchronous Design Blog. Hi everyone, Albert here. I hope you're doing well. Today I wanted to talk about style. What is it and where does it come from? Before we talk about style, and specifically style related to architecture, let's talk about clothing. Most of us wear it. We kind of know how to use it. So I would say that clothing is used, besides for the basic purposes of keeping out rain and weather and keeping us warm, it's being used in a couple of different ways. One is it's a form of creative self-expression in the clothing that we choose, the colors, the patterns, how we mix and match them. And I would say once a style becomes established, it becomes a sort of kit of parts, and it can be emblematic of membership in a subculture. And so if you take those same uses of style and apply them to architecture, it actually works, the fit works pretty well. Architecture too, like clothing, is being used for a form of creative self-expression, a form of a form of being emblematic of membership in a subculture. And of course for those basic functions of keeping out rain and weather, keeping us warm and cool. Thirdly, though, architecture is oftentimes elaborating on the use of a building or the technology used to produce the building. And so there's one additional bit of language that isn't commonly used for clothing that we see throughout the history of architecture. So if you look back at the history of architecture, architecture of course is very old. There's a famous quote from Philip Johnson, a well-known New York architect, who had said, architecture is the second oldest profession. A architectural theorist of the mid-18th century, Abbé Loger, wrote about the primitive hut. And the primitive hut was, in this case, being romanticized as a kind of idealized, transparent, earnest expression of a building's structure and technology. For example, a primitive hut being built in a forest would be made up of tree branches that are lashed together. So we're taking locally available materials, locally available construction technology, and the building is a expression of that in a kind of a pure way. And so primitivism in that case is sort of being romanticized. And as civilization started to arise, become more sophisticated, we get to ancient Greece as an example, where the parts and pieces of Greek architecture become a kind of vocabulary. So there's in the Acropolis, for example, there's the use of repetitive columns, there's the use of gables and cornices in a kind of preordained, prescriptive way. Interestingly, even at that point, even though this is quite a long time ago, some of these references harken back to a prior construction technology, timber, which was not being used for these Greek temples, Greek governmental buildings. They were actually using stone, but some of those parts and pieces are actually expressing timber because it had already been established as a kind of language which was being used for the sort of messaging value points. Messaging, in the case of Greek architecture, that has lived on to this, that has survived, and we see today, messaging about the power and the legitimacy of the Greek state, the power and legitimacy of democracy, the greatness of the pantheon of Greek gods, perhaps, and so on. And so, if you take that same use of style and carry it over to another civilization, ancient Rome, we see that they took some of that same kit of parts, the Greek kit of parts, and evolved them to Roman building technology, where concrete started to be used, masonry started to be used, and we see the development of the Roman arch. We see the use of style to, in this case, advance the agenda of the Roman Republic or the Roman Emperor, and express these ideas of legitimacy, power, perhaps hearkening to a romantic idea about democracy, Greek democracy, but in this case transformed to the Roman Republic. And again, style starts to morph away from what originates it to a kind of language, a kind of kit of parts, formal language. And moving forward now to the Middle Ages, another well-known style, Gothic architecture, which was predominant with a lot of Catholic churches of the time throughout Central Europe. A lot of great examples in France, Notre Dame being a well-known one. And we see a few things going on. One is a return to architecture as a kind of expression of the building technology, because of the technological feat of building essentially high-rise buildings out of stone. And so we see the development of the pointed arch, the pointed Gothic arch. We see the use of flying buttresses, which are stone elements, vertical stone elements outside of the enclosed space to support the roof loads of these very high stone buildings. We also see a very early use of multimedia, the use of stained glass as a storytelling element. So style can be not only sort of an undercurrent of messaging about legitimacy and things like that, or it could be overt about this is a story of that from the Old Testament or the New Testament applied as a kind of storytelling to the parishioners. And moving forward now to something we are very familiar with in our modern day, that's modern architecture, which really took hold in the early part of the 20th century, primarily out of East Germany, the Bauhaus. And at that time, it was kind of a novel and earnest expression about, and again, this is sort of a romanticized ideal about the benefits that could come out of the Industrial Revolution, factory production, and the allowance for using steel and concrete and glass to create hygienic, well-lit, beautiful, simple spaces for the common man that could be easily repeated, could be inexpensive, and so on. So, and also a place to apply the creature comforts that came out of this Industrial Revolution. And so, again, this is sort of an idealized way of doing architecture which expressed that technology and was a creative self-expression. Well-known modern architects of the time, Mies van der Rohe, and others, Walter Gropius. That morphs by the time you get to the middle of the 20th century. By the mid-century, modern architecture has become what we call the international style. And the international style is kind of an international calling card of a particular cultural subgroup, subculture, a calling card about legitimacy, money, power, and it becomes emblematic of corporate America, the Mad Men architectural style. So the glass and steel high-rise building on Park Avenue becomes a calling card about membership in a common subgroup, sort of like a business suit. You're okay, I'm okay, we can do business with each other. And so throughout these times, we see both the origination of new styles that start off as a kind of creative self-expression or an expression about function or technology, but that then morphs into becoming a kit of parts, a kind of language, a kind of understood style that expresses something else, something about some kind of messaging that the sponsors of that particular building, that particular style want to convey to users of that building. And so we see throughout architectural history both that and revivals of these very old styles for the same reasons that these styles were done to begin with and became popular to begin with. So we see Gothic architecture reappearing in academic institutions, Oxford and Cambridge in England. We see it being used in America in some of the Ivy League universities. We see it at Yale, examples here and there at the University of Pennsylvania. And we can analyze perhaps what the messaging is there, but perhaps it could be something about scholarly pursuits and the parallels to scholarly pursuits in medieval churches. We could see it as examples about or messaging about legitimacy, about stateliness, things like that. And again, it becomes a sort of calling card about membership in a subculture, and so on. We see revivals of classical architecture as well throughout the ages. In America, at the latter part of the 19th century, there was what's it called? The World Columbian Exposition of 1893, I believe, which popularized classical architecture as a kind of way to design cities. And this caught on and became an impetus for a number of cities to build their city halls, for their businesses to do banks and post offices in this kind of style. And again, long removed from classical architecture being used because of the technology or as a form of creative self-expression, but for the messaging value points. And again, you could surmise that maybe there's messaging about legitimacy, about the continuation of Western culture, and so on. There's also, throughout this period of time into present day, there's the creative self-expression that continues to happen. And of course, this is great. This is what is the impetus for new styles of architecture. But once these creative self-expression works become too popular, they become copied, and again, less about earnest, transparent expression and more about messaging about some agenda or another. And so this is the sort of cynical aspect of style that's certainly there and continues to be there. Very recently, there was a news blurb, this was only a week or two ago, put out by an architectural trade magazine, Architectural Record, which mentions that the U.S. federal government is considering requiring future federal buildings to be done in a classical architectural style. So this is, again, an interesting use of very old styles for messaging value points. And as an observer of architecture, I hope this conversation about the use of style, where style comes from, is of interest. It allows you to maybe decode buildings that you see beyond the sort of surface appearance of things. And if you liked it, please feel free to comment, like, or subscribe, and we'll talk again soon.